This is Acid Horizon, a theory podcast which confronts global crisis and the specter of a world that could be free. This is episode 5, Mark Fisher and Postcapitalist Desire, a reading of Egress with Matt Colquhoun. Thank you for joining us. Hey folks, this is Craig. Before we start our episode, I just wanted to let you know that our interview with Matt Colquhoun on Mark Fisher and Post-Capitalist Desire went about 2 hours. Now, I trimmed the episode down a little bit. I cut it in two, and I put the latter half on our Patreon page. But I understand not everybody's in a position right now to fork out extra money. So if you really want to grab it, please hit me up on Twitter or hit us up on Instagram and we'll just send the episode to you. Maybe one thing that you can do is just share the podcast on your social media or just connect with us on social media too. That helps us out. Well, in any event, let's get started with today's show. Welcome to Acid Horizon, the theory podcast. On today's show, we have Matt Colquhoun, author of the lovely, haunting, and eminently philosophical biography of Mark Fisher entitled Egress on Mourning, Melancholy, and Mark Fisher. Matt is both a writer and photographer, and he also produces content for his blog, xenogothic.com. Also with us are hosts Matt and Will. Matt, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Matt, maybe you could offer a bit more on your background and current projects.
As you say, I've been blogging at xenogothic.com for about 3 years now, and that's given birth to quite a few things since then. At the moment, I'm trying to get some photography back on the blog. I was trained as a photographer originally and used to have a photo blog for a long, long time. Writings kind of took over. Just finished a second Mark Fisher project that we'll probably talk about in a bit. It's an edited collection of some of his lectures, and got a few other things in the oven. A book on accelerationism, which I'm hoping to finish soon. Something else in the American West, and something on philosophy and adoption.
And recently, I noticed on your blog that you've conducted a virtual lecture on K-punk and its ongoing legacy. And as you might already know about us, the existence of this podcast is derivative of this massive global event we're all part of. I'm just curious, how have recent events shaped the community surrounding your work?
Yeah, it's been a very strange time. I suppose my book Egress is concerned with one community quite explicitly. And that community was always quite amorphous and in some respects doesn't even exist anymore. But it was a community that kind of offered a glimmer of another way of life that sort of couldn't exist beyond the event horizon of returning to the world of work after graduating from university. And like so many things, lots of things can't really escape that event horizon of the working world. But there's, I think there's something else here now that is resonating with that, in my mind, quite explicitly from the sort of new communities that have arisen online and elsewhere around the coronavirus pandemic and kind of revitalized politics that's come out around that. I feel like it's not really a coincidence that Black Lives Matter's got, it feels like it has a lot more resilience as a movement now this year than it did 2014, precisely because, we're already all quite used to the fact that normal life has been suspended. And it's a lot easier to suspend other things as well. But I suppose we'll see how long that lasts and how far those ripples travel, I suppose.
Could you tell us what immediately led you to focus on Egress as a writing project? And what did you think the biggest challenge was in approaching that project?
So Egress was initially my master's dissertation, which is quite a strange thing to acknowledge, I think, in orbit of a kind of writing project like this. And it's a strange, it feels like a strange book to me because it's constantly narrating its own existence. And it's usually it's not common for a dissertation, whether that's for any kind of degree at any kind of level, to then, reach bookshelves and still retain the mark of its birthing from the academy. In a way, that's kind of the tension that the book's about, really. The strange in-betweenness of certain projects or events, political projects, that it's cultural projects. And yeah, the death of Mark Fisher, which is kind of the book's central event, is kind of the precisely that moment. It was a moment experienced, for me at least, in the explicit context of university. But it's an event that's continued to have, implications and ramifications for my life and other people's lives far beyond that context. And what happens to an event like that, the experience of an event like that, the memory of an event like that, and what it kind of those kinds of events can change into after the fact, is partly what I wanted to explore. So in that sense, in terms of what the biggest challenge is in writing that project, I guess it's hard to really pick one. It's been the whole project was a challenge from start to finish, and it kind of continues to be. It's more or less a year since I finished it and submitted it for publication, even though it came out just a few months ago in March this year, and it's already changed a great deal in my mind anyway. And I think that partly the desire to finish it and put it out in the world, make it what was quite a private thing, make that public, was, I think it was I had this strange desire that it would bring some sort of closure, which in hindsight is probably is the last thing it was ever going to do. But that's kind of, it's raised new challenges and kind of kept it going. So it's a book that tries to narrate an existential shock in a way, and that shock is still rippling out into the future for as far as I can see.
So, in the wake of that existential shock, as you say, there's also an aspect to your book that I think is quite enabling for us as philosophers, activists, and readers of theory. In what ways do you think that maybe other people who experienced this existential shock became enabled, maybe in the same way that you were, or maybe positively transformed despite the tragedy that was Mark's death?
It's almost an impossible question. I feel like, to some extent, that it's a book that's given me a great deal of hope, and it did at the time of writing it. But that hope's constantly being challenged, and I guess that's partly what I mean in saying that the challenges of the book have only just gotten more intense even after the fact of writing it. That what the book's now capable of doing, what Marx thought is capable of doing, what philosophy in general is capable of doing, and how it's able to stay resilient despite the sort of ebbs and flows and deaths and births of various different projects and people, even, is something that is very difficult to put into words, really. And I think that if there's anything that I hope that the book can provide to people, it's a way of showing how that kind of project can be held open, I guess, despite the world around you sort of telling you otherwise.
I love the way that you put that.
I wanted to jump in there because one of the things, I mean, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you've said before that one of the reasons you wanted to write this book, and one of the reasons why you continue to write about Mark Fisher, is a kind of frustration with the ways in which he gets distorted and misused and almost turned into a caricature of himself by others. And so one of the things I read from on your blog recently, which I really, really liked, was the capitalist realism of capitalist realism is ending, which I really, really liked, because there is this habit, right, where every time we go through some sort of regular cyclical crisis, every single time the answer is capitalist realism is finally ending. And of course, at least so far, it never has. So, are you trying to sort of provide a sort of corrective to the popularly accepted vision of who Mark Fisher was and what his work represented?
In a way, it's an attempt to just elongate out that process. In a way, I feel like there's a habit that I think it's a habit that everyone has in a way, especially when discussing things online, and even in forums such as this. Really, I think that the strength of this sort of, and this is something that I found with my own blog. I think the strength of offering this kind of conversation and this sort of content, for lack of a better word, that allows people to kind of hear quite casually, really, what various people, whether in their circles or not, are thinking about and about the world around them. I think the casual nature of that can sometimes lead people to make assumptions and rush into sort of final opinions in a way. And I feel like that there's a strange tension between holding a thought open and allowing sort of new uses for it to come into being. It comes down to it's like a fundamentally philosophical question, right? Of like the what is truth. I feel like that kind of specter of something that can be true. It's as if to sort of delay to acknowledge that that is the goal, but to sort of also delay the speed at which the systems that we're in, particularly what Mark would call communicative capitalism, want to kind of reduce that truth down to some sort of very basic, superficial notion that can be easily assimilated, really. And I think that's kind of one of the defining questions for a lot of people trying to get into philosophy. It's like, why does it have to be so difficult? And that could be anything, why is philosophical language often so technical, so full of jargon and so unruly, as if it doesn't want to be understood? Is it just pretentious, or is it something else? And I always feel like the best argument for that is that, yeah, it's to sort of hold off assimilation. And for me, as soon as Mark died, there was a process that started where the thought of this man who, has been in himself and in his writings, had been such a bugbear for the left for a long time, that had many of his own controversies, that had never really, had struggled to kind of make a name for himself in a way, which seems bizarre to say that now, since he's sort of so in vogue. But yeah, Mark was not a popular thinker in the way that we usually, I think I remember seeing something somewhere that some of Mark's friends saying that, the main thing he wanted to be was to be a pop star in every sense of the word, whether that's, musically with his various projects. And I think that was even, they're sort of saying that was even true of him as a philosopher. But I think that the thing that comes with that, and that's true of all pop stars in a way, is that, when someone becomes so known, the work that they've done can be reduced down to some sort of glib reduction. And that happened with Mark very immediately. So I think that part of why I wrote Egress and why I've continued to write about Mark in a way is to try and almost slow down the assimilation of his writings into some sort of popular discourse, so that not to say that Mark should remain a cult figure, but so that the idea of him that we have is at least a well-informed one, and that it stays true to the challenges that his thought wanted to bring into popular discourse. He wanted to be a part of the conversation and disrupt it at the same time. And I think that's what people find so commendable about his writing. But I think there was a review of my book in Tribune magazine that kind of said it quite clearly. It's often been the case in the last few years that there's been no sort of figure that Marx needed more protection from than Mark Fisher fans. As sad and as quite provocative as that is to say, I think it's definitely true, and that's true of anyone who enters the kind of popular imagination in the way that he has recently.
I think while you're on that, I'm just wondering, Egress is such a fascinating work, particularly because right after you provide, such a striking personal analysis that leaves like a pretty heavy impact on anybody who reads it, you jump right into some of the more subtle influences that are kind of only tacitly present in Mark Fisher's work. And I was wondering what pushed you to engage with, say, thinkers like Bataille and literary theorists like Blanchot, when generally, like you say, so much of the discourse surrounding Fisher is sort of this reworking of Deleuze and Guattari, a sort of blending of various post-structural figures from Baudrillard to Foucault. I'm wondering, part of what makes this text so interesting to me, and I think to many, is the way in which you engaged in kind of an archaeology of Marx thought. Was that a difficult process to do, to connect these dots, given what the general consuming public has access to, right? Because Bataille is present in texts like Capitalist Realism and The Weird and the Eerie, but not explicitly. Was that kind of a central tenet of your project? And can you explain maybe what was going on there?
I think in a way it was the resonance between this understanding of what Mark wanted to do, right? That sense of a popular disruption, or like a popular dissensus, I guess, and how a lot of Mark's writings in a way, and a lot of his neologisms, these really sly combinations of paradoxes, really. I mean, it wasn't a conscious decision to like openly challenge Mark's thought and this sort of sense of who his influences were. in a way, the inclusion of Bataille in particular, who's so central to the book, and wasn't the fact that the few times that Mark does write about Bataille explicitly, he's quite scathing and dismissive of him. But I just didn't think about that, to be honest. Bataille was just hugely important to me. And I was reading a lot of Bataille and Blanchot specifically right before Mark's death. It was sort of serendipitous in a way. I'd been working with Bataille and Blanchot explicitly because whilst a student, I had a separate essay project that I'd started before Mark died that was about the performance art group Coombe Transmissions, who later became better known by the name Throbbing Gristle. Coombe Transmissions were from my hometown of Hull, and in early 2017, there was an exhibition organised in Hull, just sort of a quite maligned coastal town in the northeast of England. And there was an exhibition there that was to sort of celebrate their work and to provide a sort of retrospective of their performances before they kind of, became these pioneers of industrial music. It was at that time that Cozy Fanny Tutti, who's a member of Throbbing Gristle, she'd written this autobiography about her time before joining the group, whilst she joined it, and then a lot of what happened afterwards. And in that book, there were a lot of quite shocking accusations made against her former partner and bandmate, the recently deceased Genesis Peorage. And that just raised quite an interesting question for me, that in this moment that was celebrating this work done, these two people were coming back together in the shadow of these quite serious accusations. And it made these questions emerge of, how can a group that was so renowned and so defined by its transgressive performances and its transgressive artworks be re-understood in an accusation of this quite abusive relationship. And the most obvious level, that's not really difficult thing to untangle. There's a great difference between, the consent given in a piece of artwork and the lack of consent that, in an abusive relationship. But at the same time, there's still a sort of complex dynamic there, and especially in the context of putting on this exhibition, of how to ethically celebrate what one of the people, Cozy Fanny curated this exhibition for herself. So what's the ethical approach of engaging with an archive of transgressive artwork that's so defined now in many people's minds by this other sort of the shadow of this abusive relationship? And Bataille was the most obvious person to turn to there. If his project can be defined as anything, it's an ethics of transgression. And I think that that's true of Mark's work as well. Despite what Mark has written about Bataille, and to a lesser extent Blanchot on his blog, I personally just see as incorrect. I don't think that Mark was right in his appraisals of those people. And that, in the situating Mark in the history of the ideas that he himself's engaging with, Bataille lingers there in the shadows. He's sort of the missing link between two of Mark's most central influences, Spinoza and Lacan. He's written a lot about, Deleuze, for Deleuze and Guattari. Blanchot plays a huge role in The Thousand Plateaus. Bataille is a sort of central thinker for a lot of black metal theory, which is arguably the most productive cultural theoretical synthesis that kind of came out of two of Mark's key interests, hauntology and accelerationism. And for accelerationism, the central text of that philosophy was Jean-Francois Lyotard's Libidinal Economy, which is a reading of Bataille with Marx. So, I got some flack more recently for, even thinking to include Bataille in this book, just because of Mark's opinion of him over someone like Stuart Hall. For me, it wasn't something I even considered. As far as Mark's own projects were concerned, and as far as my own project was concerned, to do something, to write a book that I wanted to be, in a very generic sense, an ethical project, that was nevertheless seen as, by many people around me, as being a transgressive project, in it being initially quite a private thing that I was working on. The sense was seen, why are you using the event of this moment of quite, horrific trauma and grief to get a degree? How can you, write about one thing in service of something so institutionalized? And that's a question that continued after, we'd graduated. Why should I be the one to write this book about Mark's work, to narrate the circumstances of his death as if as some sort of cash grab or clout grab? But in a way, it's the tension is the same. The tension that I really enjoy about Bataille's work, with the frankness with which he, engages in an ethics of transgression. That was the question that I found in reading Bataille, in looking at the culture of the city from which I'm from, and the immediate circumstances around Mark's death in a university.
I think it's really important that you included Bataille in the book for two main reasons. I think when it comes to writing a monograph and a eulogy like you have, there's a creative element to it, right? And I think of Deleuze here, who feels that a blend of fidelity and novelty is crucial to doing philosophy. And I would argue that there's even a creative element in writing a eulogy to someone like Mark. And I also think the inclusion of Bataille is apposite in this case, given Bataille's own particular way of thinking egress, and especially
Yes.
as you talk about limit experiences. And for Bataille, I think of how, for example, Bataille's notion of egress involved a critique of the political insofar as it was only incidentally capable of providing ruptures that afforded enlivening possibilities. And so I think by you doing that, it very much invokes the spirit of Mark's work.
Yeah, I mean, that's great. And that's the hope, really. I mean, it's but in a way that's kind of, again, it extends the question outwards, that the fact that, I hadn't even considered this before publishing the thing. But the fact that this question's now been raised is actually something that I've kind of perversely enjoyed, as perversely as writing the book itself, and that it keeps these questions going, and it keeps I think it sort of demonstrates how Marx's thought in itself is not settled. That we can have already this sort of this opposing opinion that some people will see the use of Bataille as being a great way to extend Marx's project, and some will see it as go a step too far in mutating Marx's project. But the capacity that we all have for doing that, and what that can do, not just to Marx's thought, but to thought more generally, is, to be honest, the sort of question that I wanted the book to ask. So as difficult as it's been I didn't expect that question to be reflected back on me quite so pointedly in some instances. But I can't complain.
In Egress, you detail your own struggles with mental health in conjunction with those Mark experienced. And you also mentioned how Mark believed that our engagement with politics can be, at least partially, an antidote to the atomization and dislocation we experience in our world. Has adopting this premise availed you in your own struggles?
To be frank, no, not at all. But in a way it just further complicates the relationship, I think, between mental health and politics as a topic that Mark became, for some people, really well known for talking about. I think it again just demonstrates how much tension there still is within that kind of formulation. I think it should be made clear that at the time of Mark's death, and this is something that was been told to me by those that were very aware of what he was going through in the last few months of 2016. At the time of his death, he was not thinking about his final depression politically at all. I think it was Tariq Goddard, who runs Repeater Books, said it was actually all too personal in the end for Mark. And I think that in a way it's quite a harrowing truth, but in a way it's an important one, because I think that it's been all too easy for some people to read into Mark's death as if to say that Mark's death is a failure of his thought. And in a way that my own book asks that question at one point, but I think it's a question that when, given any sort of serious engagement, very quickly falls apart. But it's an important one to deal with. And I think that part of that comes from Mark's ardent critique of what he calls the therapeutic imaginary, which gets a bit of discussion in Egress, which I think we've seen take on a sort of new form on Twitter recently. I can't remember who it was. It was one of the sort of usual gobshite Twitter leftists sort of saying that, therapy should be mandatory under socialism. And that's been a tweet that's spawned 1,000 memes. But, and I think the critique of that tweet, whoever sent it, and I can't even remember the source now, which is the case with all good memes. But that's, I think it's an important thing to interrogate, because that's an argument that flies in the face of a lot of, post May 68 radical leftism that Mark was engaged with. The writings of Deleuze and Guattari, engaging with the anti-psychiatry movement at that time, trying to precisely undercut the sense that mental illness is something to be solved through a kind of magical voluntarism, as Mark called it, or that it was, that it should be seen through the lens of, again, what Mark called a mandatory individualism, to say that your problems are yours and yours alone, and that you should therefore, just take a will to be kind of come out of them. In a way, Mark made that point himself, to sort of say that we need to socialize our sense of mental illness, but socializing our understanding of depression is very different from institutionalizing it through a form of, therapeutic psychiatry. It's a socialized, it's not a kind of therapy gulag, as some people have put it, but it's a socialized treatment. It doesn't other madness, but it works with I should say, neurologically atypical in a way to, build new ways of community living for everyone. And that kind of project, doesn't emerge from that kind of psychoanalytic relation. And a lot of those, the likes of Lacan and whoever else made, that's the Lacanian turn in psychoanalysis to really interrogate the implications of that relationship between analyst and analysan.
This is something that you highlighted in the book as well, Mark's lens of the weird and eerie as perhaps being part of the positive ethical program that he proposes. One of the things that I really appreciate about that, it's almost like an operationalization. Did I say that right? It's almost like operationalizing Sartre's notion of absurdity in a way and kind of drawing it into a collective political project that manifests itself through art, music, and so forth. Is that an ethos that you have engendered in your own work as a writer or photographer?
Certainly in the writing of this book. I feel like in a way that's kind of the difficulty that kind of now defines it afterwards. I mean, the fact that I think that's part of the reason why it has to be made clear that the book emerged from the university, because in a way, to summarize it most cynically would be to say that it's a kind of memoir of a student experience. I hope it's much more than that, but in a way that's true. That's what it is. But in a way that's kind of what's really important about how it was able to emerge from that moment. The fact that 2017 for me was not only the year that Mark died, that was defined by a lot of grief and pain, but it was also a year without work. It was a year when I was sort of alleviated of a lot of the more general worries and concerns that dominated a kind of quote unquote normal life. And the grief of Mark's death, in a way, it was weird and eerie in the sense that it produced a very real glimmer of a world transformed. I feel like our experience on campus was quite distinctly different from those people that mourned Mark, whilst going about their day-to-day lives. And a lot of people have been cynical about that, and I think it's very easy to be cynical about that. But in a way, that's the same reason. That's the same for the same reasons that we're cynical about students more generally, or the working class more generally, or the unemployed more generally. As if to say that to the experiences you can have when you slip out from underneath that kind of capture, to celebrate them is derided as sort of being idealistic or hedonistic or irresponsible or whatever else. But I think for us, that wasn't the case. We kind of managed to find this exit through the academy. And in that moment, we kind of saw another way of living our lives. And I think a part of what then defines the rest of the book after that moment's kind of over, because the book sort of it covers a time period from 2017 to 2019, which for the most part, for those 3 years that the book was written through, 2 of those years were spent in more or less full employment for me. And I feel like part of the melancholy of the book, in a way, is trying to hold on to the instances where that glimmer of that other life kind of re-emerged in that otherwise normal day-to-day capitalist existence.
I've read some of the responses to your book. I mean, you mentioned the one about Bataille earlier, right? And one of the things that strikes me, I asked you earlier about how to prevent Mark Fisher's ideas from being simply, recuperated back into a kind of undangerous sort of way of thinking or discourse. But of course, I never knew Mark, personally, but I know 2 things from reading about him, speaking to people who did know him. One was that he was an educator in many ways, right? He spent his entire adult life teaching in different institutions and trying to explain these things to them in ways that made sense to them and encourage them to go out and do things with it, right? And so to me, one of the things I really like about it is that you don't simply say, here's what Mark Fisher thought, let's just leave it there, let's sort of cast that in stone and worship at that altar. I mean, from everything I know about Mark, that probably is the last thing he'd want, right? If someone could go out there and do something productive with what he's done, go further or critique him or have new ideas, that's basically following in his spirit, I think. And that's why I think it's a good thing to do. But on that note, one of the things I was wondering about is that one of the similarities I've noticed in both your book Egress and his writings, particularly Capitalist Realism, is the huge variety of sources, different thinkers, different ideas, different traditions. And one of the problems I've seen raised with Mark Fisher is the way in which he'll sort of flip between, say, Zizek and Lacan, and then move straight over to Deleuze and Guattari, and then back to Freud, and then over to someone else. And as fascinating as all that is, and it draws out new sort of intuitions and things. Do you think there's an issue there of sort of cohesion, or do you think there is a kind of underlying cohesion in what Mark was trying to do with his work?
I think that what I like about Mark's work in that regard, and I mean, I feel like it's a fair point, and it's something that's definitely true of me too, I think. But and again, this is probably something that a response that Mark would have really despised, because it depends on my love of an author that he also really didn't like. But one of my favorite books is W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn, which, as I understand it, was one of Mark's least favorite books, because it's written about the Suffolk coastline that he knew so well. And actually, when finishing Egress, I had the opportunity to do a sort of final proofread of it in my girlfriend's one of her relatives has a house in Suffolk, and we stayed there, and I managed to read it over a weekend. And as we'd been staying at this house in Suffolk a few times, I decided to read Sebald sort of in situ, which is a sort of rite of passage that's been fetishized by a lot of people, particularly sort of the Robert Macfarlane sort of psychogeography crowd. And I actually found myself understanding what Mark hated about Sebald the most. And Sebald has this really depressing, quite cruel description of Felixstowe. And what Sebald describes as this quite just a bit of a hellscape, really. But what I saw, and I can assume what Mark saw, was frankly just a working class town down on its luck. And so I think it's Sebald's lack of a sort of social context in that regard that Mark really hated. That being said, what I love about that book more than anything is the way that it meanders in much the same way that Sebald does, and not just physically, but in the psychogeographic sense that as much as he's walking along this coastline, his mind wanders. And the very first chapter of that book is this kind of long mediation on death that I think I've read over and over and over again, because you just get totally lost in the movement of his thought. It's as if you're sort of reading his, this incredible thinker lucidly, just like it's a stream of consciousness that's truly philosophical, not just some sort of like it's considered and incredibly well informed. Yeah, there's this strange tension between a cohesive sort of argument and just the very nature of thought moving. And I think I've read that book so many times that it's probably quite both conscious and unconscious influence now, that's the kind of writing that I really love, and it's the kind of writing that I love to write. I like trying to reconstruct the movement of thought as it sort of passes through things. And I feel like, in a lot of ways, Mark's writing does the same thing. And I feel like it's not just, it's not the pretension of, of referencing Sebald there is probably a bit over the top, when really it's just a question of, it's just blogging. I think that's the impact of blogging on writing, really, is that it's kind of what blogging has taught me that my, no academic degree ever could do. I think that the amount of I think when I clock up the amount of words that I've written on my blog and post it, and people just go, I think people think that regardless of whether I post numbers, just like, how the fuck do you write so much? But it is literally just a case of having a thought and just writing it down. And sometimes those thoughts lead to other thoughts, and just doing that leads to it. What's not in my mind a sense of productivity. It's just thinking, and I feel like that's what I learned that as much from Mark as I did from any other kind of literary projects. And I feel like that comes across in his books, for better and for worse. But personally, the fact that he manages to capture the movement of his own thought in that way is something that's really refreshing, and it's done well even less frequently.
Yeah, so I was wondering, is there like an underlying unity or system in which you can see in Mark's work? Because I've seen attempts to draw out some in the past, because the nature of his writing is so, it has that sort of train of thought style to it. Do you think that's fair, or is it
I think it is there, but not in the way that we're maybe used to seeing. Because I feel like this is kind of part of the project that I'm trying to work on at the moment on accelerationism and where it came from and kind of what happened to it. And part of this, I think, is what I've found is that the moment that accelerationism as a term and as a kind of blogospheric topic is born is around a series of interviews that Alain Badiou gave, and which Slavoj Zizek also commented on, about what Badiou calls the crisis of negation. And maybe we can go into that a bit later. But I think the one thing that I found in reading some of Badiou's stuff that was very influential for the early blogosphere that Mark was a huge part of was that Badiou has this argument in, I think it's his book called Philosophy for Militants or something like that. And he talks about the way that a new philosophy is always needed to kind of help birth a new science. Science understood in a very general term. And he has this list where it's like, Plato helped birth mathematics, Kant helps birth Newtonian physics, Marx and Hegel helped birth history, Nietzsche, Bergson, and Deleuze helped birth biology. And the question for Badiou is what comes next? I think the blogosphere initially, maybe because of not just in terms of it being sort of a gathering of big egos like Badiou, but just the fact that it was philosophy being done in a new space, being done online in the blogosphere. And whether that's the right place for philosophy to be done is a worthy question. Ray Brassier, who was also part of that whole contingent, definitely doesn't think so. But that initial moment that we kind of now know as being the sort of speculative realist movement was an attempt to bring out a new philosophy that could support and kind of help develop the new sciences of the age, specifically our kind of new cosmic perspective on ourselves. So in that respect, I feel like that's the underlying project that Mark was initially a part of. He had his own niche within that and developed his own sort of ideas and theories. But he was kind of part of that wider tapestry in a way. And that's not really like a cohesion. It's a movement that lacks cohesion explicitly. There's so much disagreement. But in a way, it's like all parts of this kind of, whether that's the speculative realists or the object-oriented ontology or Prometheanism or accelerationism, all of these things emerged from that moment. And despite them being so disparate, they kind of all have this same, in their initial instance, this same sort of thrusting towards the new. And that's, for Marx, best known for engaging with that culturally and more explicitly politically later on. But for people like Brassier, it was the case of doing that scientifically. For someone like Graham Harman, it's arguably sort of metaphysically or even aesthetically, and a combination of the two. And yeah, you can keep listing various different names and people in there. But I guess that's kind of what I mean when Mark talks about this sense of a popular dissensus. It's strange to think about the cohesion of that moment is precisely a lack of cohesion. But in a way, I think that's the only way of thinking about it, considering how it's still such a, we're still in this moment. It's a moment that's not over yet, despite capitalism as a sort of system hoping that it will be, and sort of always dragging the system. And accelerationism is kind of what I'm interested in drawing out in this new project is precisely how accelerationism has been the victim of its own critique in a way. Accelerationism wanted to address the fact that politics always slides back into a reactionary state of inertia in the present moment, and all of these thinkers wanted to precisely find a way philosophically out of that. And now with accelerationism itself, what we found is that, it's fallen on its own sword. It has succumbed to that very same process of violent reactionary inertia in its far right variant.
That's something I was hoping we'd have a chance to talk about, because it's that exact question which you find in so much of Mark's work. But I know actually all three, me, Will, and Craig, wanted to talk a little bit about post-capitalist desire.
Yeah,
and me and you talked about that earlier this year in Huddersfield a little bit, because part of my paper was on that, and then we had some great chats about partly that weird long table thing. And one way of sort of putting that question was, well, I noticed in Egress, there's actually quite a few references to Marcuse, which is great. I mean, I love the guy. He's a brilliant thinker. So what I wanted to do is, there's a quote I came across by Marcuse, and I thought I'd put it to you and see what you think Mark would make of this idea, and what that means for acceleration is more for for some form of So in the preface to Eros and Civilization, I'll sort of truncate the quote, but he says, whereas previous revolutions brought about a larger and more rational development of the productive forces, in the overdeveloped societies of today, revolution would mean reversal of this trend, elimination of overdevelopment and its oppressive rationality. The rejection of affluent productivity, far from being a commitment to purity, simplicity, and nature, might be the token and weapon of a higher stage of human development based on the achievements of the technological society. As the production of wasteful and destructive goods is discontinued, a stage which would mean the end of capitalism in all its forms, the somatic and mental mutilations inflicted on man by its productive force may be undone. I read that earlier today, and that seems to me to be the sort of, perhaps this perspective which Mark is actually criticizing in Postcapitalist Desire and others like it, when he talks about design of socialism and things. So, wondering what you make of that.
I think that that's something that Mark would, in a way, maybe in some, when he's got some certain hats on, agree with entirely. And Mark liked Marcuse a great deal and saw him as a kind of proto-accelerationist, precisely for those reasons.
Yeah.
But in a way that's accelerationism in its kind of affirmation of that kind of thinking isn't an ejection of the crisis that is at its heart. The question of a post-capitalist desire, of capitalist desire even, is something that is something that Marcuse quite explicitly introduces into popular political thinking, specifically in Eros and Civilization, his book on Marx and Freud. And that's that lineage is kind of what Mark wanted to attach himself to, and the lineage that goes from Marcuse to Deleuze and Guattari, to Jean-Francois Lyotard, to Nick Land, to whatever comes next. And they all, each instance, it's a question of, do we really want what we say we want? And to what extent is what we want even something we can have any sort of control over? I feel like the Landian and the Leotardian and Landian intervention in that kind of thinking is that, which in a way is still necessary today. It's an attempt to think desire in itself, without, devoid of any relationship to the human. In a sense, it's a Kantian move. The way that, the way that Kant's philosophical project is one that no matter what topic he's talking about, it's a sort of rational system that, where every theory is kind of commensurate with each other. So like his theory of time and his theory of causation both kind of overlap, and they might seem distinct on at face value, but they're kind of both entwined with each other. And I feel like that's something that continues in thinking of the speculative realists and the accelerationists and everyone else, and Marx thinking, in that the Brassier sort of introduces the idea that philosophy needs to think the universe in itself, which science has kind of made unavoidable. For him, nihilism wasn't some sort of pathetic edgelord sort of disavowal of your own agency, but it's the only realistic position that you can take under the scientific advances that we've seen, that demand, we see ourselves in a way of a diminished sense, and we kind of have to think the world in terms of physics and thermodynamics and all these other forces. I mean, I'm not a scientist, but that's my understanding anyway, in themselves, sort of devoid of us, and that's kind of the demands on thinking in present. And that kind of thinking is then, is for Alex Williams, who is most famous perhaps for co-authoring Inventing the Future with Nick Cernick, initially on his blog in 2007, under the influence of Ray Brassier and Nick Land, Alex Williams wanted to put forth a left Landianism that didn't just give a cosmic perspective on the planet, but tried to look at capitalism in itself. What is capitalism devoid of any relationship to the human? And I think in lots of Marx's work, Alex Williams would kind of scrub all of that Landianism from his. The blog doesn't exist online anymore. You can find it via the Wayback Machine, but he's kind of scrubbed that quite fortuitously, considering how Land is seen now, not undeservedly. But Mark, I think, takes that a step further in taking this sort of strange Freudianism and this Spinozism, and not just asking what the planet is in itself, or capitalism in itself, but also asks what is desire in itself. What are our desires beyond any fidelity to our own thought processes? And that sounds maybe kind of like a useless task, and even a bit of a fantasist one, but in a way I feel like it's what's demanded of the moment.
That seems to be the common thread, doesn't it? Desire is what runs through these different thinkers, and trying to think through, at least someone like Marcuse and also with Mark, is how do we think about desire, beyond capitalism, right? That seems to be where it's going.
Yeah, but it's even like it's. I mean, I think that the nature of that question is so twisted. It's kind of like a quantum desire sort of else or something, where I feel like, I mean, again, the part of this trajectory kind of emerges specifically from sort of Anglosphere, in that like the most important influence on all of this thinking is the English translation of Freud's use of the word trieb. I think I'm pronouncing that right, which is, it's initially translated as instinct and then is translated as drive. And both of those things can also be understood as desire. But the importance of choosing drive over instinct is it kind of jettisons the biological association. Trieb can also be used to translate as sprout, as in the growth of a plant emerging from the soil. But that biological way of phrasing it kind of limits our thinking with after the Industrial Revolution. So calling it a drive gives it a more mechanical and machinic quality. The introduction of that thought is going to follow through to its end. As capitalism and industrialization has progressed, to the point where you get, Land's most famous proto-accelerationist text being machinic desire, which in a way is just an elongated way of saying drive. But the implications of thinking drive in that way, of any drive, whether that's, the infamous death drive or something else, is that, our understanding of that keeps developing and becoming more and more complicated as capitalism and industry itself in themselves develop. So that for Mark, it becomes, in his PhD thesis, Flatline Constructs, it becomes not just machinic in terms of cogs and gears, but, cybernetic. And that's something that, that continues to, I think Land's most recent project on Bitcoin and philosophy has a great deal to say about the next development of that thinking. Whether anyone will even bother to give it a look in, considering what he's done to his own reputation, is another question. Personally, I'm kind of tentatively still interested to read what he has to say, because that project in particular, I think, could be hugely important across the political spectrum. And the questions that he raises and the things that he makes possible in thinking Bitcoin philosophically are really important to revitalizing the sort of what now seems like the dead project of accelerationism.
Well, now that we've broached the topic of accelerationism, I would like to turn the focus back to your book, where you do talk about accelerationism and Mark and Nick Land's relationship. Of course, Land applauds the triumph of capital as the zenith of desire and its history. Mark certainly opposes that view, but with the qualification that post-capitalist futures remain emergent within the spaces produced by neoliberal capitalism. But one of the things that I wanted to touch upon were the objections to accelerationism, whether it were a right or a left variant. A common objection to accelerationism from the left is that it has the potential to be catastrophic and could harm underserved communities, for example. Now, recently, David Harvey cautioned the left about the dangers of a catastrophic disruption of capital, which then, of course, drew criticism from all sectors of the left. But in the book, you attempt to vindicate Mark's brand of accelerationism with the claim it does not mean accelerating any or everything in capitalism willy-nilly in the hope that capitalism will thereby collapse. Rather, it means accelerating the processes of destratification that capitalism cannot but obstruct. So in view of our current historical moment and the possibility of revitalizing accelerationism, how might have Mark or you yourself imagine the project of refurbishing accelerationism to proceed?
Yeah, it's a really great question. On the one hand, the objection that accelerationism from the left being sort of potentially catastrophic is a non-starter for me. I think there's any political project has the potential to do people harm. That's the risk that you have to take when you embrace change. And that's not to say that that a bunch of largely white male theorists should advocate for radical change at the expense of other communities. Should we denounce Black Lives Matter because it's a movement that might lead to the further persecution of Black lives? That's precisely what's happened. State capitalism threatens and indeed enacts further persecution as a response. So they enforce the status quo through fear of repercussions. And I feel like, as far as acceleration is concerned and how it can proceed, acceleration is happening whether we like it or not. But this is the question of where, it's a fact of taking some sort of charge of what we can do in the process. Acceleration is happening, change is happening, but, the question is in favor of whom? Silicon Valley's monopolized what Mark and Jody Dean called community capitalism. And the point is that we have to do what we can, if anything, to sort of assuage capitalism's co-option of these new desires. So it's worth emphasizing that Black Lives Matter is incompatible with capitalism and the structures that keep it in place. Precisely, the police, the military-industrial complex, first and foremost. The problem that accelerationism throws into this equation is that it is precisely, again, it comes back to this question of the crisis of negation, which is, Karl Marx puts this forward, first of all, in the first volume of Capital, and he relates it to, I think it is anyway, was it the second? I'm not that, I don't know, I'll get lost in page references for Capital. But anyway, Marx talks about the negation of negation as a sort of fundamental process within capitalism. And it's a really knotted process that leads to a lot of confusion. And I think because of this confusion has been ejected from the question of accelerationism altogether, unnecessarily. But for Marx, it's a question of, he uses the example of individual property. So feudalism has to abolish individual property. You have to facilitate the class struggle. The proletariat cannot own their own property. That's left to the bourgeoisie. So the proletariat have to work. It's one-on-one stuff. But Marx argues that when we transition to capitalism necessarily has to sort of reintroduce the possibility of individual property. In theory, everyone under capitalism is capable of owning their own home. It's stressed in theory. But the issue is that in doing that, again, this is what Marx argues, that if the ownership of individual property is universalized, then there's no such thing as individual property. You just have social ownership. You have capitalism leading necessarily to socialism. But capitalism has to then, that's the negation of negation. But the capitalism, as we've seen more recently, has to, put drag on its own project. And we can see that coming in the form of rent. You abstract the feudal relation so that you're no longer just doing work literally for the feudal lord. You are, you go to work so you can make money that you then pay to your landlord. You put an extra sort of degree of separation in there. And now what we see is that we see rent sort of becoming the standard way of engaging with the world, not just in the sense that you rent, most people rent, I assume, rent where they live. But now we also see that making, cutting into culture. So you don't just rent where you live, you rent the media that you watch. You don't own movies anymore, you rent access to them. And the same with music.
That's a really interesting thought, that the proliferation of subscription culture is a kind of anti-production within capitalism.
Yeah. And there's a few people that have written about this. I think Peter Fraser's one, he has a book on Verso called Four Futures. And one of the features that he puts forth is this idea of rentism, that, rent will just take over, that we'll have nothing, you'll have to rent everything. You'll rent food even or something, which again, you kind of can see that you can subscribe to, have food delivered to your house. With that becoming the norm, you completely, you get again almost back into feudal relation. You abolish the idea of individual property. That's kind of the perfect example. In Marx's initial formulation, the universalization of individual property leading to socialism, that's the kind of thing that capitalism produces for itself, but then it has to obstruct for itself. Otherwise, it's signaling its own demise. So when Marx talks about accelerationism, in terms of this crisis of negation, they're talking about the staying, aware of how that process works, and the ways that capitalism necessarily tries to stall it. And that's not just true economically, but, again, politically. Then that's something that we see right now with Black Lives Matter. They think that's, the way that movement lost its momentum in 2014. We saw the exact same sequence of events as we're seeing now. There was all these protests, riots even, where individual property was destroyed. And then the response to that comes from media conglomerates that says, well, okay, we'll remove instances of blackface. Or I just saw before joining the podcast, there was an Indian skin lightening cream has decided to change its name to, so it makes it seem like it's less of a taboo to have dark skin, even though, but the product still exists. And then, that's it's totally superficial, but that's the process of what Deleuze and Guattari call reterritorialization. And the benefit of that happening now is that we saw all this happen previously in 2014, and it worked to an extent, and then we kind of went back to our inertia. But now that it's happening again, we're very aware of what's happening. We're we see it for what it is, which is a superficial kind of attempt to assimilate radical protest back into capitalism and corporations. And there's a sense that it's not working. What more can that movement do to to reject those processes and kind of push further beyond them? We've gotten to the point of talking about police abolition and or police reform, even in a sort of soft left version. And now we get to the point where we have, the left, especially in the UK, with like Keir Starmer, the Labour Party, sort of calling that idea ridiculous. But of course he would, because he's a QC and was a human rights lawyer for so long. He's part of that establishment that depends on these kind of the systemic structure of capitalism and everything that comes with it, be that racism, classism, etc. So yeah, I guess just the point being that that crisis of negation where it is pervasive and it's everywhere. And that was always what accelerationism initially, in its first instance, wanted to attack and kind of draw attention to and produce consciousness of. But that's waning, I think, more and more. And I think that's the one thing that, that project needs to revitalize for itself again, not just for the sake of a few internet bloggers, but, for all of us.
With the recent spate of uprisings embedded within the context of the COVID-19 world, there was about 6 to 12 days in June after the killing of George Floyd, where it seemed like we were first of all, we all took on a sense of seriousness and urgency about the matter. And it seemed for a short time to create this rupture where something could and did in fact happen. But like you said, it wasn't very long after that. And I think right now we're kind of in the beginning stages of the bourgeois class reappropriating this narrative, making these superficial sorts of changes. I mean, for me, pulling down Confederate statues, Christopher Columbus, all of that is great stuff. But it seems that the urgency and seriousness skirted class analysis. In short, I don't think these protests were too big for the apparatus of capture. And the ensuing effect, like you suggest, is this reterritorialization of capital. And we're back to business with inter-left feuding on places like Twitter. And this exchange of resentments is arguably enhancing the vampire castle that Mark Fisher talked about. And I'm wondering what Mark's brand and style of analysis would have brought to this moment.
Yeah, I mean, it's a symptom of that same crisis of negation. And again, to affirm that the crisis of negation is a phrase that Bataille uses in this interview. I think it's on lecan.com. And it's called the crisis of negation. But the way he puts it there is that it's like a line that Mark would say himself. The crisis of negation is that we are capable of destroying the old, but we're incapable of producing the new. And then in a way, that's I think the issue that comes from some of the destructions of statues. In the UK, at least, when protesters tore down the statue of Colston in Bristol and threw him in the harbour, that was an instance that to me felt quite different from, it was the first instance of tearing down a statue we'd seen in this country. I think that, there's a somewhat of a precedence for it now in the US. But when that happened in the UK, there was sort of a sense that I think in a way it felt more important because it was so un-British. It was so impatient. It was so unruly in a way that I think we're nationally not known for. That's what made it quite a sight to see, I think. And actually, it seemed to ignite a certain sort of moment where the destruction of the old, in the terms of that statue, gave birth to a new kind of consciousness that had been suppressed by, the bureaucratic discussions that had previously been held around that statue, going on for sort of 30 years, all solved with some collective action. Whether to what extent that's capable of actually sustaining itself and producing class analysis is certainly, I think, the question that Mark would want to ask himself. And I think that our capacity to do that remains diminished. But that, I think, was what he wanted to do with Acid Communism, his book that he was next working on, quite explicitly. And it's evidence for that, I think, is what's going to come out in this new editorial project that's just been finished, that's called Postcapitalist Desire, that should be coming out on Repeater Books as an ebook in a couple of months, possibly September.
Well, that's perfect, because I was just going to transition to that part of our
Yes,
interview
great.
here. I'd like to finish up by talking about Postcapitalist Desire and the essays that you're working on, or the unpublished writings. They're unpublished, correct, currently?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And my question is, what are maybe some things that you've seen in this unpublished body of work that have stood out to you in the process of organizing them?
In a way, it's I guess it goes back to a question that Matt had before about the consistency of Mark's project. Postcapitalist Desire is the collection is called that because that was the name that Mark gave to a course he was teaching at Goldsmiths at the time of his death. He planned for a 15-week course that was to interrogate the very questions associated with that phrase. Do we want what we say we want? Only 5 of those lectures went ahead, but all 5 of those lectures were recorded. Those recordings were made available pretty soon after Mark's death. I took it upon myself to transcribe the first of them. And in a way, I mentioned this in Egress, it was kind of beyond Mark's death that doing that was kind of the galvanizing moment that made me want to write the book. And in a way, it kind of shows that the book may have been slightly premature, or even not premature, but, I got caught up in the rest of the year that unfolded. There was, I translated one lecture, and then life just got in the way. So in a way, it's this project's an opportunity to not just be a tease and to share those recordings. There's 5 transcriptions, or lectures, I should say, that deal with, in order, they deal with, see if I can remember them, the concept of post-capitalism and the tensions around that phrase. Is that a phrase that gets trapped in the post of postmodernism? Is it right to have a project of capitalist abolition in a way that is so tied in its name to capitalism still? Mark asks those questions, and he goes on to address the rise and fall of the counterculture. Gregory Lukács, he looks at Gregory Lukács' book, History and Class Consciousness, and puts forward that Lukács' project is quite explicitly a psychedelic Marxism, and it's kind of in predicting a sort of consciousness raising. He goes on to the disavowal of the working class that followed the 1972 US election. And then finally, he talks about Jean-Francois Lyotard's writings on the biddinal economy. And I think I tie all of this together in quite a lengthy introduction that situates these different lectures in the context of Mark's other writings. So as much as I think the assumption is that Acid Communism was a lost project that only had an introduction written and then was lost with Mark himself, in fact, a lot of the discourse can be seen, I think, quite evidently to be a sort of workshop for that next book. And Mark draws on a lot of writings that he already has out in the world, but actually aren't that widely disseminated. For the most part, none of them appear in the K-Punk Reader that was put out a few years ago. And I think what becomes clear in that is, the consistency of his project in terms of what happens, after we become aware of capitalist realism. Once we've, I think that that book succeeded hugely, and that it's become a word that everyone's a phrase that everyone who's engaged in some sort of left-wing politics seems to have a popular awareness of. But, that's only the first step. And Acid Communism is a kind of, I guess, the sequel of what comes next. And even, an analysis of why previous attempts to establish that kind of group consciousness failed. And it's quite obviously a very complicated and inevitably unfinished document. It's immediately apparent that there's hidden depth in there. And it goes a long way to clarifying Mark's project, I think, beyond its kind of reductive appropriation by a few sort of soft left Corbynites in the UK.
I don't take for granted that people who are coming to this podcast or to Mark's work have read Postcapitalist Desire. So I'm going to frame a question in a way that positions you as the avatar of Mark Fisher. I'll be the Terminator. How's that? That's a terrible pun, but
I like it.
When I imagine someone encountering this essay, Postcapitalist Desire, for the first time, I imagine them asking themselves what Mark Fisher means by desire, just the word itself. I think one of the reasons I put forward this question is the very example illustrated in the opening lines of the essay. Is it possible to disentangle things we think we want from the very system that provides us with them? I think if we get tripped up by a facile notion of desire, Marx's analysis is a non-starter for us. But perhaps this question seems basic for folks like you and I and Will and Matt who've been immersed in this discourse community for a while. But it seems to me, as it did for Mark Fisher, to be important to return to the question raised by Deleuze and Guattari, which is, what is the relation of desire, as Mark Fisher sees it, to politics and advanced capitalism, and why is that question important to us if we're going to move beyond capitalism?
I mean, I think partly I guess we've touched on this a bit before in terms of, for Mark, it's a complicated term, perhaps in the fact that it's heavily weighed down by Freudian associations. So, the desire is one word of many.
Now, if you haven't checked it out already, you will probably want to read Egress on Mourning, Melancholy, and Mark Fisher by Matt Colquhoun. It's published by Repeater Books, and it's available on their website. Go ahead and check out Matt's blog at xenogothic.com. We'll put the information in the show notes. Do you want to continue the conversation with us? Matt and the rest of us on Acid Horizon go deeper into post-capitalist desire. We talk about Deleuze and Guattari. We talk about Freud. We talk about the death drive. If you want access to that part of the episode, go ahead to our Patreon page and subscribe to us for as little as $1. But like I said earlier, now might not be the time to do that. So if you really want it, go ahead and hit me up on Twitter or Instagram or find our Facebook page, and we'll just send that episode right on over to you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.